Do you want to get your blending tones as smooth as possible and go from this to this? Well, here's how I do it. So for me, the general idea with blending graphite as smoothly as you can is to avoid obvious pencil marks. This allows us to build a nice consistent layer that we can add to. I'll be drawing this image of Miles Morales because it's relatively simple and won't need the same intricate detail as a more realistic drawing, so I can show how to get really basic but smooth tones and gradients. A good even tone with as few streaks as possible is key, regardless of whether we're blending different tones together and trying to make it seamless, or simply trying to make one block tone look as smooth as possible. One of the best ways to do this is to not press too hard when drawing. If you dig too deep and make a really obvious line that you don't want, it can often be difficult to fix it. So you want to try and be more gentle and keep things steady and even. Something that can really help is holding the pencil at an angle, as it can help discourage you from using too much pressure and allows you to layer nicely to get the full coverage you need without the overly streaky marks. But sometimes you need more pressure. At this point you just need to try to keep the pressure as consistent as possible. I also try to keep my pencil strokes really close and compact. It lets them blend into each other and mix on their own, which can give a nice consistency while allowing us to get our darker tones. Typically, the darker I go, the shorter and more compact my strokes become, so I can really focus on getting every little bit as consistent as possible. I find it helpful to work with shorter pencil strokes even when working in bigger areas. Trying to fill a big area too quickly can lead to the drawing looking rushed and the pencil layer not covering everything you need it to, which can make things difficult when you get to the blending stage. I also really like layering in different directions. By doing 2 or more layers going in different directions, you can already start to hide the marks quite nicely, so that when we get to the blending and smudging stage, it leaves our tones looking super smooth. Just make sure you're careful with the pressure in some places, otherwise the multiple layers can make your tone darker than you might want. All in all, you want to make sure your drawing is nice and smooth before you blend it. Regardless of what technique you prefer, getting consistent layers with as few obvious pencil marks as possible is the key to a smooth finished blend. So we've laid down our layers. Now it's time to blend them, and for that we need blending tools. There are a bunch of different tools you can use, each with pros and cons. Firstly, we have a tissue folded into a point. They're good because they're readily available. You can fold the tip into different sizes and they're great for blending larger areas. The downside is that depending on the size of your drawing, it can be hard to fold them into a small enough point for the delicate details. Next we've got blending stumps. These are my personal favourite. They're very comfortable and easy to use. They can last a really long time if you look after them, and the smaller ones are amazing at blending the tiny fiddly details. They're an amazing all-round blending tool. The one downside is sometimes I struggle to keep bigger, flatter areas consistent with them. I don't like blending larger areas with something that has a finer point. It takes ages and I find it tough to keep it consistent. I could use the blending stump at an angle, but sometimes it's still not quite big enough. I find the tissues are best in these situations because you can get a nice flat blending surface. But that's the only downside I can think of with blending stumps. And number 3, a finger, preferably your own. They're readily available and free to use, but it's messy, not as precise, you can't fold it into a finer point, and also chemicals from your finger can sometimes damage the paper. I imagine a lot of it depends on how naturally sweaty you are, but all in all, I wouldn't recommend using your finger for blending on any drawing you consider super important. It's fine if it's just a quick sketch that you're not too precious about, or if that's the style you're into, but for full artworks with intricate details, I'd suggest a blending stump or the tissue. I usually use both. I tend to use the tissue for bigger areas and backgrounds. It's a bit quicker and I feel like I can keep my tones more consistent on the larger surface area. Then the blending stumps are perfect for everything else. Another technique I sometimes use to make my tones smoother is called circularism. Circularism is when you draw in continuous little circles. When used with a bit more pencil pressure, it can make some really cool textures and is great for drawing skin. But when used lightly, it's another great way of getting a consistent tone that can be blended out really nicely. I also sometimes use Circularism with the blending stumps and tissues to help keep things looking smooth. But regardless of the technique you use, things should go well so long as you've been consistent and careful with your pencil layers. So using these different techniques to get my layers, I'm going to build up the face tones and get this side ready for blending. It's important to remember that you don't need to get the tones perfect first try, you can always build on them later and darken or lighten them if needed. But getting those first couple of layers nice and smooth will put you in a really good place for adding the later layers and details. Lastly, a quick bit of advice on cleaning your blending stumps if you choose to use them. It's easy to rub graphite that's on the blending tool onto the wrong part of the drawing and cause difficult to fix smudges, so most of the time I try to keep them clean. There are a few ways to do this. One of them is with a scrap piece of paper. It doesn't get off all the graphite, but you can see it's gotten rid of the worst of it. You can also use erasers. I imagine this would be easier with a kneadable eraser, but I don't have one at the moment. But it works fine with my current eraser, and you can see the difference it's made. I also use sandpaper. The sandpaper and erasers work better than scrap paper for me, but sometimes you don't need to get rid of all the graphite and just want to stop the worst of it from smudging, so I often have some scrap paper on hand. You can see how clean the stump looks by the end of it compared to how it was when I started. Quick side note, with blending stumps I use one end for the darkest tones and one end for the lighter tones, and I also sometimes use dirty blending stumps to help with really subtle details in my drawing, like freckles and soft marks on a face. So by all means keep them clean, but a dirty blending stump has its uses too. I don't usually draw an entire half of the face before blending everything. I usually blend as I go, so I can always reach the area I'm working on without fear of smudging it with my hand. So now I'm just going to go over it carefully to refine the areas that need work and finish up the drawing. And that's how I get nice smooth blends with graphite pencils. It's a great thing to learn and it's not too hard. You just got to be careful and make sure you stay consistent with your layers. Even with the more detailed drawings with lots of texture, a good smooth foundation is a great start to build on. And finally, here's the finished drawing, nice and smooth and all blended. It's a very simple concept, but a really good one to learn that works with almost any art style, so hopefully this video helps you with your blending. If it did, remember to like and subscribe to see more in the future, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.